Welcome, Ari.
Thanks, Alex. So yeah, I'm very excited to have Helen McCreery here with us today. As Alex mentioned, it's been a long time in the making. I think we've been trying to get her here for a while. So I'm happy it's finally happening. So Helen is an independent postdoctoral fellow at the Self-Organizing Systems Research Group at Harvard, which is headed by Radhika Nagpal. And she actually comes from, she's a nice interdisciplinary scientist coming from an engineering background. She did her bachelor's and master's in environmental engineering at MIT. And then she did her PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder. And since then, she also worked for, I think, a year at Michigan State University at the Beacon Center for the Study of Evolution and Action, which is actually where I last crossed paths with her. And she also has been awarded a fellowship that's quite interesting for many of our members, which is the McDonnell Complex Systems Fellowship, which she got right out of her PhD. And so her research is focusing on understanding how complexity and collective intelligence emerge in these decentralized groups with relatively simple individuals. So she mainly works on ants, as you'll see, studying really interesting phenomena like cooperative transport, obstacle navigation, and self-assembly. And she uses both theoretical models and really cool, clever experimental manipulations to study these phenomena. So with that, we're really excited to hear from you today, and I'll hand it over to you, Helen.
Thank you. Thanks for that really nice introduction, and thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And I also appreciate you coming at what is not normally your regular seminar time, so that I really appreciate that too. Yeah, thank you all for being here. I'm excited to tell you about some of my research. Now, as Ari just mentioned, I'm broadly motivated by wanting to understand how complexity and patterns and even intelligence emerge from groups of simple individuals. And one reason I'm so particularly excited to talk to this audience is I know I don't have to convince you all of how important collective behavior is across all scales. And today I want to focus on control mechanisms of these systems, on how these systems respond to changes. All biological systems, whether we're talking about collectives or more centralized systems, have to constantly respond to changing environmental conditions. And a system's control mechanisms, like the central nervous system's control of breathing, or like behaviors of honeybees that regulate temperature in their hives, these mechanisms affect how responsive they can be and their overall resilience. And there's reason to expect collective systems might face particular control challenges, because they have to coordinate whatever sensing, decision-making, and actions they have across their dispersed individuals that sometimes might only be loosely connected. So how are decentralized systems dynamically controlled? And I want to dig into this a little bit further. You're perhaps all familiar with lots of the known benefits of being part of a distributed system. And I know some of you have actually contributed to that great body of literature yourselves. And just to name a couple quick examples, we know that decentralized groups are robust and that they often make better, more rational decisions, but there also might be costs. And so you might think centralized approaches could be faster or more nimble in the sense that they might be able to respond more rapidly to new information. So I like to think of this as distributed systems having high inertia. High inertia might be more costly in some circumstances than others. It might not be costly at all in really stable environments, perhaps. But if we think about tasks that require a lot of flexibility, maybe because they're being performed in conditions that are constantly changing, maybe the task itself sort of, the individuals have to interact directly with a changing environment, or even just tasks that require a lot of trial and error, I think it's reasonable to expect those kinds of tasks to be challenging for distributed groups. And yet we see them succeeding. Some groups are really good at those kinds of tasks. And so today I want to tell you about two projects that I've worked on, exploring sort of how collectives are able to succeed at tasks that, at least naively, I might expect they would find really difficult. And so the first of those is a task that requires high flexibility. So this is dynamic control of self-assembled bridges in army ants. And then I'll shift gears and tell you about a task that requires trial and error, in this case, collective problem solving during cooperative transport. So I just want to mention that this Army Ant project is sort of hot off the press, or it will be. It's not actually off the press yet. It will be coming soon in Nature Communications, so look out for that. All right, so I'm going to start with the army ants, and many of you might be familiar with the structures that army ants form, and I know some of you have worked on them and done some really great research. So they form these amazing responsive structures. So bridges are one example, and that's what I focused on. They form all kinds of other structures too, including temporary nests that they construct every day. And these bridges in particular are formed in order to support heavy traffic flow over their foraging and migration trails. So they have these foraging and migration trails with very heavy traffic, and these bridges allow them to essentially take shortcuts and smooth over kind of difficult patches in the terrain to kind of maintain traffic without a lot of traffic jams. And we know from previous studies that these bridges rapidly adapt to changes in traffic. So for example, the bridge will get larger if the traffic increases. But because these structures are often built on unstable features like twigs and leaves, they also face an extra challenge, which is that sometimes the ground literally moves beneath them. And what hadn't yet been studied is how these bridges might adjust to changes in the geometry of the terrain that they're built on. So if a bridge is connected between a twig and a leaf, and the leaf is sort of moving in the breeze, that's gonna sort of exert some force on the bridge itself. So can they adjust to those sorts of changes? That was the focus here. I just want to acknowledge Radhika Nagpal and Simone Garnier. This project was a collaboration with them, as well as some other undergrads that I will mention later. And so they were really instrumental for this project. And there are three main questions I want to talk about today. First is, can these collective structures adapt to changes in terrain geometry, and how does that happen? What can we learn about the control mechanism for this, and what can we learn about the consequences of that mechanism? And then third, how is that control mechanism implemented through decentralized behaviors of individuals? And in this talk, I'm really only going to have time to focus on the first two questions, the sort of collective level questions, but I will share just a little bit about the third question as well. So I conducted experiments for this in the field on Barro, Colorado Island, BCI in Panama. And so I had all this equipment. Every morning I would hike out into the forest to look for robust foraging trails with heavy traffic. And when I found one, I set up my equipment. And I just want to point out a couple of things about this. Actually, can you see? Oops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry about that. Somebody sort of shout if you can't see my my cursor here. Hopefully you can. But so I have these two platforms, and you might be able to see it's well camouflaged, but here there's sort of a ramp made up of leaves, and there's another one on the other side made up of a stick. The ants are using that ramp to climb up onto this platform and get across and then go down the stick, or they're going the other direction. The point is, I convinced these ants to move their foraging trail, their existing foraging trail, onto my platforms. And then in the middle here is, encircled in yellow, is a bridge made of ants. So the other important thing about this equipment here is that by turning this gear, or this wheel, I can move this beam in and out. So I can manipulate the size of the gap that the ants are having to cross with their bridge. So I looked for an ant foraging trail, set up my equipment, convinced the ants to move on to their foraging trail. I did that by, they were already walking on these leaves and the stick, so they have their pheromone trail. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't impossible. And then once I did that, I could then create a gap that they had to cross and manipulate the size of the gap. All right, so I'm going to show you an entire video of an entire experiment at very fast speed. So this is obviously drastically sped up. You can see I started with no gap at all, and then I formed a gap by moving this beam by 1 millimeter every 30 seconds. And so I'm kind of constantly forcing the ants to adjust their bridge. And I'm going to continue to expand the size of the gap until it reaches 30 millimeters, at which point I'm going to start contracting the gap again. So that's going to happen in just a few more steps. And then so as you can see, the gap is now closing, and I continue to do that also by 1 millimeter every 30 seconds until there's no more gap. And you can already tell that the ants are in fact adjusting to these changes, and they're able to even sort of recover from even what appear to be pretty catastrophic breaks in the bridge. So, so they're clearly able to do this task where things are constantly changing for them. Okay, so that's an entire trial sped up a lot. Here's a chunk, a section of the middle of a trial at regular speed. You can see that the ants can walk pretty effectively over these bridges. They maybe get slowed down a tiny bit, but they're able to, they're pretty effective functional bridges. And just because I think a lot of people might be curious, they are carrying food, their prey. So these ants typically, this is Eceton hamatum, that's the species, and they typically prey on other ants. So that's ant, brood and things. All right, so for all of my trials, I have videos of the sides of these bridges, as you can see here. And then I also got videos from the top. So I have top view and side view for all of these trials. And having both of those views allowed me to kind of reconstruct three-dimensionally what the whole bridge looks like. So I just want to touch briefly on how I extracted data from these videos. It was a long process, and I'm going to skip over a lot of the details. So I'm happy to tell you more about it if anyone is interested. But I took these snapshots of the bridges through time, and from both the top view and the side view, I wrote up some code to automatically extract essentially the silhouettes of these bridges. And then I combined those. So that allowed me to estimate volume, mean cross-sectional area, how kind of taut or slack the bridges were, and a lot of other things as well. And I did this for every second of each trial. So I have really pretty fine temporal resolution. I can really see how these bridges are changing in time. What this automatic data process does not do, however, is tell me sort of how many ants are in the bridge or when are ants joining and leaving the bridge, because it's even, you can see probably from the videos, it's even hard for human eyes to count the number in the bridge and to really see what's going on. So that's, I didn't want to try to do that with computer vision. So instead, we had this manual data extraction process. So I really want to thank Georgina, Anna, and Grace. These three undergrads did this mountain of really, really challenging work, and they developed the system to do this. And what they did was keep very careful track of exactly when ants joined the bridge and left the bridge. So we have the exact timing of those events, which also allows us to keep track of the total number of ants in the bridge as well. So we have a precise count, and we know when ants are joining and leaving. So these are the kinds of data that I was working with. Okay, starting with the first question. Can these bridges adapt to changes in terrain geometry, and how? Well, you already saw from the video that they do, but let's look at that quantitatively. I want to take just a second to orient you to this graph because you'll see a bunch just very similar to it. So here we have volume on the y-axis, and the x-axis is the gap size. So it shows the volume of the bridges at different gap sizes. And right now, I'm just showing you the data for the expansion phase only for one example trial. And so in time, we're moving from the left to the right here. We start with no gap, move up to a gap of 30 millimeters. And you can see as that happens in this trial, the volume of the bridge expanded. So the bridge gets a lot larger, which makes sense. Then when I add the data in here in green for the contraction phase, when I'm decreasing the gap size, now we're sort of moving the other direction. So we start with a gap of 0, move along the orange line up to 30 millimeters, and then down along the green line back down to no gap. And the key thing here is that when the gap size decreases, also so does the volume of the bridge. So these bridges are rapidly adjusting to changes in the gap size. Now, you might also notice that there's hysteresis in the system. So for a particular gap size, say 15 millimeters, the bridge is larger during the contraction than the expansion. And this was true not only in this one trial, but in all of the trials, as you can see here. So all of the trials had on average more ants for a given gap size in the contraction than the expansion. So what this hysteresis means is that the state of the bridge, in this case its volume, depends on the history of the system. It depends not only on the gap size, but on what happened before. The bridges don't respond the same way when coming and going, and they're consistently larger when contracted. So we saw this hysteresis in the volume, and we also saw it in other things. So this is the number of ants making up the bridges. Bridges have more ants during the contraction than the expansion, which makes sense, given that they're larger. So in general, there's extra mass in these bridges as they get smaller. And that extra mass is going towards the bridges being thicker during the contraction as well. So this is showing you the mean cross-sectional area that's higher in the contraction. And not only are they thicker, they also hang lower. They're more slack during the contraction. So the y-axis here is essentially how taut the bridges are. During the contraction in green, they droop more. So overall, I found hysteresis in the response of these bridges to gap size changes, looking at several different metrics. For a given gap size, bridges are larger with extra mass when being contracted than expanded, and that extra mass is going towards them being thicker and more slack. Okay, so to kind of recap this first question, I found that yes, army ants are able to adapt to changes in terrain geometry, and they do that by dynamically controlling the number making up a bridge. And I found that these adjustments have hysteresis. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about hysteresis for just a minute, because it's important. It's found in a lot of biological systems. And we humans also intentionally add hysteresis to lots of engineered systems because it can stabilize the control of those systems. So hysteresis stabilizes control. So just as an example, think about a thermostat. When the temperature in a room is close to the set point of the thermostat, hysteresis is what prevents the heat from constantly switching on and off. And so we wonder, does hysteresis in these bridges potentially play a similar stabilizing role? And so I'll talk about that as part of this next question. So here, what is the underlying control mechanism that allows these bridges to adapt? So I approached this question with mechanistic models, and I compared 3 alternative behavioral models of individuals deciding to join the bridge, becoming part of it, and individuals that are already in the bridge deciding to leave. This is how the total number is controlled, of course. So as I mentioned, I had multiple alternative models, and all of these models are data-driven. So none of them have any free parameters that I can tune. I was really trying to let the data speak for itself. Okay, so first I want to know, can a simple behavioral model reproduce the hysteresis that we saw in our experiments? And we were particularly interested in whether a linear model could work here, or do we need nonlinear dynamics for this to work? And then also, not just, can we reproduce the hysteresis, but I also wanted to see whether these models produce reasonable bridges at all. Do they produce bridges that seem like they would work and support traffic? All right. So I first explored a linear model. This is sort of the simplest first model to look at that had constant probabilities of joining and leaving while the bridge is being expanded, and separate constant probabilities while the bridge is contracting. And I thought constant probabilities is a reasonable expectation because the gap size was also constant at 1 millimeter every 30 seconds. Okay, so for each time step in the simulations, I drew the number of joining and leaving events stochastically from distributions that are fit to the data. You don't need to sort of digest the details of this figure, but that's just showing you that these distributions of how many events to expect, how many joining and leaving events to expect in a time step are grounded in the data. And then I simulated how the model would behave under the same conditions as the experiment. So starting with a gap of 0, changing it by 1 millimeter every time step, so increasing to 30 millimeters, and then contracting back to 0 at the same rate. So for this simplest linear model, remember, we're looking for hysteresis like the kind we saw in the real experiments, so this is just a cartoon up here in the corner, but the important thing is there should be more ants in the contraction phase. So green is higher than the orange. Green is the contraction phase. Here are the simulation results. The bold line is showing the average behavior among 10,000 simulations. And you might notice there's not as much hysteresis, but more importantly, it's in the wrong direction, with more ants in the expansion on average than in the contraction. And that's just because of a slight asymmetry in the joining and leaving probabilities in the two phases that came from the data. All right, so the simplest linear model doesn't work. The next thing that I explored was a linear model with a delay between when ants decide to leave a bridge and when they're actually able to physically leave. And we wanted to try this because intuitively we thought that if ants stick around longer in the bridge, there should probably be more of them in the contraction, and that kind of intuitively seems like it could lead to hysteresis. So I looked at a whole bunch of different lengths of delays, but regardless how long the delay was, this model still fails as well. So for both of these linear models, we have very little hysteresis, and more importantly, it's usually in the wrong direction compared with the actual experiments. Okay, so I next developed a nonlinear accumulator model, and this model assumes that the bridges can handle small disturbances without adjusting at all. But as changes in the gap size accumulate, the ants become more and more likely to adjust the bridge. So specifically, the joining and leaving rates in this model are based on the deficit, or really just the difference between the number of ants that are in the bridge and whatever the equilibrium number of ants would be for that gap size. So whatever sort of the quote ideal number is, how far off are you from that? That affects your likelihood of joining or leaving. And this model is also parameterized from the data. So I found what the equilibrium number of ants is in the real bridges using the data. So that's the probability that leads to the number of ants that leads to the same probability of leaving as joining. And then once I had that, I also used the data to estimate the probabilities of joining and leaving for a given difference from that equilibrium. So again, you don't need to sort of digest these graphs either. And I'm happy to sort of answer any questions about them or go into them more later if you'd like. But the point is just that every step of this model was also data driven. All right. So here are the results for this nonlinear accumulator model. And unlike the linear models, it does actually reproduce the right kind of hysteresis with more ants during the contraction than the expansion. So it looks more like the data. Green is on top here, just like you'd expect. And it also looked more, the simulations looked more similar to the real data in other ways as well, like sort of how bursty joining and leaving events were, things like that. Okay, so everything I've just shared with you about these simulations was where I was mimicking the conditions of the real experiment. So if you think about what we did in the experiment, we were imposing kind of directional changes to the gap size. The gap would get larger and keep getting larger, and more, and perhaps more saliently would stay larger for kind of a long time. These are lasting changes. And we do expect in nature these bridges to face that kind of change. If you think about as ants or not ants, as animals are moving through the leaf litter, they might be disrupting the kind of twigs and leaves, whatever the ants are building on, in such a way that does create sort of large, lasting changes to the gap. So we do think this is a relevant context for these bridges. But in nature, they will also experience much more momentary and smaller shifts as well. And so we wanted to see how these models perform under that condition too. And I should just mention, I actually think that these small momentary shifts, which will happen as a bridge is just sort of in the breeze, these bridges might just kind of vibrate, the leaf that they're on might quiver. That I witnessed that in the field, and we think that might be a pretty common thing for these bridges to experience. And so we wanted to test our models in that condition too. So here's the kind of next experiment we tested our models against, where we did have an expansion phase similar to before, but now we have a long vibration phase where the bridge is just switching back and forth between 30 millimeters and 29 millimeters before contracting again. And so the point here is, during this entire vibration phase, the bridge is essentially the same size, 29 to 30 millimeters. And And ideally, you wouldn't expect the bridges to need to change that much. You know, it might make sense from the perspective of the control of these bridges for them to be pretty stable during this period. That's what we'd hope. Okay, so can the models do that essentially? So looking back to our linear models, we know they didn't perform very well or didn't reproduce the behavior of the ant bridges very well before. How do they perform with this vibration response? So here are the results. They look very similar whether there's a delay or not. The average behavior is in bold. The key thing to look at is this vibration period in the middle, the black part of the lines. The average behavior, you can see these bridges sort of lose ants over time when during vibration, which I can explain that is due to this slight asymmetry. It's not terribly important other than the fact that these models are highly susceptible to small asymmetries in the joining and leading probabilities. I can explain that better if you're interested. But the more important message here is that if you look at the individual simulations, which are the much thinner lines, they're really all over the map. These bridges are highly, highly variable. And in particular, you know, a lot of them end up with really extreme numbers of bridges. So even though the gap size is hardly changing here, something like 80% of the simulations resulted in bridges that had either way too many ants or way too few, including almost half at some point during the vibration phase. Almost half of these simulated bridges ended up with 0 ants at all, which is obviously not sufficient. So these linear models behave unreliably under conditions that are likely common in nature. If we throw this vibration test at the accumulator model, it performs much better. So there's much less variation. The vast majority of these simulations had bridges that maintained kind of reasonable, not extreme numbers of ants throughout the whole vibration period. And yeah, the behavior was much more steady. So the reason for that is that the accumulator model is self-correcting. So if in a particular time step, too many ants join the bridge, that actually changes what happens in the next time step, because it means that suddenly, you know, there's an excess of ants. There's too many ants in the bridge. That reduces the likelihood that ants are going to join, and it increases the likelihood that ants will leave. So that's kind of the behavior inherently depends on its history. It's inherently hysteretic and self-correcting, and that's why it produces consistent, stable bridges in this vibration test. Okay, we also wanted to just quickly look a little bit at the scalability and sensitivity of this accumulator model. So scalability with respect to the maximum gap size. So if instead of expanding up to 30 millimeters, we simulate conditions of expanding up to 60 millimeters or 90 millimeters, the accumulator model performs pretty much as expected. And then if we look at changing how quickly we're shifting the gap size, so if instead of changing the gap size by 1 millimeter every time step, we do 2 millimeters or 0.5 millimeter, this actually does affect the dynamics in the sense that the extent or the amount of hysteresis is a little bit different, but it still produces kind of similar patterns overall and reasonable behavior. So we think that this model is, at least in the simulations, it seems to be performing pretty well. Okay, so to recap this question, what can we learn about the underlying control mechanism? I found that our accumulator model reproduces the hysteresis that we observed in the real experiments, while the linear models didn't. And I conclude that the number of ants making up these bridges is controlled non-linearly based on the deficit, or based on some proxy, something that might covary with the deficit. And this control is self-correcting. In general, the bridges seem to be able to handle small changes in the gap size without adapting, which we also saw in the real experiments. But as those changes accumulate, the chance of adjustment increases. And our model performs well both with under the experimental conditions where you have sort of directional, long-lasting disturbances, and it performs well in small momentary changes. All right, so how is this implemented through decentralized actions? We looked at this a few different ways. I just mentioned how, I think it's based on the deficit, they're responding, the individual decisions seem to reflect the deficit, the difference between the number in the bridge and what the sort of some equilibrium number would be. But I don't actually think that the ants are calculating the deficit. So I wanted to know, what are the proximate cues? So bear in mind that joining and leaving events might have different cues. And actually that seems pretty likely if you consider that potential joiners, those walking on the bridge, might have different kinds of information than potential leavers, who are those that are already in the bridge. And so different cues might make sense here. Now, I want to warn you that this story turns out to be more complicated than we initially expected it to be, as so often happens. And I haven't completely sorted it out, but we do, there are, and I'll briefly summarize that. Initially on the performance as a potential cue, essentially the bridge to cross. Sorry, that is a cue for joining. So the bridge performance or functionality right before joining events higher than expected by chance. Ants seem to join bridges that are performing really, which is actually counterintuitive to me. And that's one reason that this out, although we do have ideas for why that might be. On the other hand, potential leavers performance as a cue at all, but rather physical cues to get more direct information in the bridge. And that makes it's reasonable to would have really good direct information, how much they're being stretched, for example, they're under, that might provide more direct information. So we do find evidence for separate cues for joining and leaving. Ants joining bridges, maybe because they're investing in portions of the trail that are functioning really well. Ants leave bridges when there are more than needed. The effect of these two things is that the bridges are size for the gap. We think there's probably other things that are going on, other cues that are affecting joining and leaving as well. But we do the effect of high performance on joining was really strong. All right, so to recap this project as a whole, I was exploring how self-assembled army ant bridges are dynamically controlled. And as a reminder, this is a task that requires high flexibility. So the bridges interact directly with the environment, with the sort of terrain that they're built on, and that often changes. And I found that these bridges are able to respond dynamically to changes in the terrain geometry using nonlinear self-correcting control. And that hysteresis in the response stabilizes this control. And this leads to robust bridges that are able to make adjustments as they need to, and avoid making adjustments to small momentary shifts where it's not needed. All right, so now I want to switch gears away from army ants and talk about a different task that I would also expect to be challenging for distributed groups, because this one requires a lot of trial and error. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this task is navigating around obstacles during cooperative transport, and it actually requires problem solving, or it can require it. Okay, so here's an example of cooperative transport. This is a group of Parachicina longicornis ants. The common name for this species is the longhorn crazy ant, so I'll just refer to them as crazy ants. And they are working together to carry a large dead cricket home to their nest. And you can see they're really good at this. They're moving pretty quickly. These ants are really excellent at cooperative transport. And actually a lot of other ant species, most ant species are pretty bad at this. If they do it at all, they're likely to sort of pull in opposite directions for a long time. So deciding which direction to move is important here. So I want to just take a step back really quickly and look at the entire process of cooperative transport. To complete this task, the first thing that usually happens is an ant that comes across a large food piece, decides that she needs help. Typically, she'll then return to her nest to recruit more workers. And once there are enough ants around the object that they can move it, they need to make a collective decision about which way to move. This direction that they pick, however, is not going to work for the whole journey back to their nest because they're going to run into obstacles. Things like twigs, leaves, rocks, everything is an obstacle on the scale of an ant. And to navigate around these obstacles, they have to make a whole series of new decisions. If they can do that, then they're likely to make it all the way back to their nest. So during my PhD, I spent a lot of time researching both this collective decision about travel direction. Actually, most of my work was on this initial collective decision about travel direction and about how they're getting started in the first place. So for example, I studied the individual traits and behaviors that promote group level success. I looked across species to see why some species are so much better at this than others, and sort of what factors about the object that they're carrying might affect their success. But today, I'm going to tell you about just a smaller part of my PhD work, looking at this obstacle navigation piece, because as I mentioned, this is a particularly difficult task. When you hit an obstacle, obstacles can be like little mazes, and the first thing you try might not work. So they really require a whole series of decisions, as I mentioned. That's a lot of trial and error, and I like to think of this as problem solving. So obstacle navigation is a complex, multi-step task that requires problem solving. It might be easy for a little rock like this, but even for an easy obstacle, they still have to make multiple decisions to change direction. And I was particularly interested in seeing whether I could find evidence for a group level strategy to solve the problems that obstacles pose. And I was particularly curious about this trade-off that exists between simple strategies that are easy to implement and more robust strategies that will work for more different kinds of obstacles. And I actually borrowed from the robot navigation literature for this. So this was a collaboration with Radhika Nagpal, and so from a robotics background. And so we were curious, there's all this work about obstacle navigation strategies in robots. Can we use that to inform our experiments with ants? Okay, so let me explain more about this trade-off between simple strategies and robust strategies. Imagine that the ants here, there are a bunch of little ants carrying a piece of tuna. Let's imagine that they have a very simple strategy that's really focused on nest direction. So when they're carrying an object home, they're really focused on moving in the direction of the nest. And if they hit an obstacle, they'll choose some other direction, but as soon as they can move back in the direction of the nest again, they will. We think this should be a very simple, easy strategy for ants to implement, because ants typically are really, really good at knowing the direction of their nest. And if these ants followed that strategy for this obstacle here, they would have no trouble. They would hit this wall, pick a direction, left or right, and then as soon as they got past the wall, they would move back towards their nest again. But that strategy will fail with this more complicated, more difficult obstacle, because this obstacle requires that they move backwards away from their goal. We can come up with other strategies that would work here. So if they were paying attention not only to the direction of their nest, but also to how far away they are from their nest at all times, they would succeed here. And we could come up with other strategies that would work here as well. But they all require knowing more information or having more complex processing than the simpler strategy. So that's what I mean by this trade-off. So we wanted to see if we could kind of use these different shapes of obstacles to kind of interrogate how the ants might be navigating around them. I did this field work with an undergrad researcher, Zach Dix, in Arizona, and we gave groups of crazy ants things to carry, so these little pieces of tuna. Once they got going, we blocked their paths with obstacles and we recorded what happened. So here's one of these videos, and I want you to pay attention to what happens when they hit the obstacle and also when they change directions, which they do at other times as well. I actually expected that when they hit the obstacle, they would sort of stop and have to regroup. And if they change direction, they would have to do that too. But these ants, they can just turn on a dime. It's like 1 second they're going one direction, the next second they're going the other. They seem to be incredibly good at maintaining coordination. Even if they don't know where to go, they're all together. They're all going the same way. So that's actually the first kind of the first key finding, is that they're really good at maintaining consensus. I looked at that quantitatively as well, but I just think the video is such a good way to illustrate it. It doesn't take them any time to switch directions. Okay, so anyway, I have all of these videos, which I extracted from these videos. I extracted the trajectories of the pieces of tuna. So this is just looking at the group level trajectory. So here are some examples of that. Excuse me. So these are some examples for that easier obstacle, and then also for the harder obstacle. And you can see pretty easily that they're a lot more efficient at navigating around that easier obstacle. And it also took them a lot less time. But surprisingly, at least to me, they still always succeeded at the hard obstacle, and it never took them longer than about 10 minutes, even though they have to move backwards to do that. So, here I was thinking the ants were going to be super focused on moving in the direction of their nest, very reluctant to move away from it. And they succeeded. So I wanted to sort of look more at how are they escaping, what's leading to them moving backwards. Before we get there, though, I want to show you a video of them succeeding in this harder obstacle. So they kept getting really close and then turning back, which was frustrating in the field, but also interesting. But they are about to make it. Yay. All right, so then once they're out, they turn back towards the nest, no problem. Okay, so bear with me while I focus a little. When they first hit the obstacle, which is the pink part of the line up here, they spend most of their time along the back wall of that obstacle, which is as close to their nest as they can possibly get. And then it's not until later on, the bluer part of the line, that they seem to explore the space more. So this made me wonder, do they actually move further backwards the longer they're stuck in these obstacles? And to find out, I extracted the distances of all of the backwards movements from all of these trajectories. And then I looked at whether those distances change in time. So here are some density plots showing the distances of backwards movements for each time interval. So over here on the right end of this plot, you have really, really short backwards movements where they turn backwards, but then immediately turn back towards their nest. Longer backwards movements are over here to the right. And once again, the redder parts of the redder lines here are earlier in the trial, bluer later on in these trials. Sorry, yeah, I said trial. This is for all of the trials. Okay, so in the first time interval, when they first hit the obstacle, almost all of their backwards movements are extremely short. They're essentially bouncing around along that back wall. And then if we fast forward to the last few time intervals, they're much more likely to move substantial distances backwards. So more of the mass of this distribution is shifted to the right, and I confirm this statistically as well. So the take-home message here is that the longer, oh, I'm sorry about that. Oh, there we go, it's back to normal. The take-home message is just that the longer these ants are stuck, the further backwards they move. Okay, so I went through that really quickly and just told you this brief little story about obstacle navigation, but I wanted to share that because I think it connects to this idea of these difficult tasks, or to what appear to me to be difficult tasks requiring lots of trial and error. In this case, the ants did have a collective strategy for navigating around these obstacles. And the first thing is that they were really good at maintaining consensus. So they stick together, even if they don't know where to go. And their strategy seems to be flexible. So it starts out that they're trying the easy thing first. At first, they're very they do seem to be very focused on nest direction. They're very unlikely to move substantial distances away from their goal. But if that doesn't work, they switch to something more robust, where they are exploring the space more. All right, so to broaden back out to the big picture, I started with the question, how is dynamic control implemented in collectives? As I mentioned, it's reasonable to expect that because these groups have to coordinate everything across lots of individuals, it might be hard for these distributed groups to handle all of the constant little decisions and changes that are required in some tasks. So how do they handle those changes? Well, I found that in the dynamic control of self-assembled bridges, army ants actually ignore kind of a lot of those changes, and they only respond to larger and more lasting ones. And I've found that when crazy ants face a series of many decisions while navigating around obstacles, they prioritize coordination over efficiency. So they essentially forego trying to make the right choice of direction so that they can stay on the same page. And they add complexity to their navigation strategy only if they need to. So I'd like to acknowledge a lot of collaborators and other people on these projects, students, researchers, people who just gave me advice. So thank you all so much. Thank you all for watching. And then the other thing I just want to mention is that I am sort of transitioning right now away from Harvard, and I'm starting a postdoc, I think next week, with Albert, who many of you know, Albert Cow at UMass Boston. He's starting as a professor there, and I'm really excited to start working with him at the beginning. We've collaborated before, and I'm really happy to be joining him in his new lab coming up next week. So thank you so much for watching. I think we have time for questions. So yeah, thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Helen, for this truly inspiring talk. I absolutely loved your take-home messages that are also appear very applicable to real life, human life. Yeah, so the floor is open for questions. And if anybody would like to ask a question, just speak up. We'll try it that way, or type a Q in the chat. Right, Kaz has a question.
Yeah, first of all, super great talk, really, really interesting, and it's fun to see all the new stuff as well. I was actually wondering, like your example of with the crazy ants, where you had in the beginning they're kind of sticking close to the not producing very much noise in their trajectories, and then they sort of increase the noise. It kind of reminded me of like the reverse of simulated annealing, where you first start out with noise and then you like decrease the noise. And I was just wondering, like, if you've thought about yeah, like does that process connect to other like maybe robotics, or like since you're in Radhika's group, or other processes that you've seen, and is there some general thing to be taken away there?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I hadn't actually thought about simulated annealing. That's really interesting. I have thought about like noise in general. I do think there's a take-home message. I do think that there's like something big about noise and collective systems, and the kind of, I think there's a lot of benefits. I think ants like use noise a lot, and it helps them kind of, yeah, do things rapidly. So I have thought a lot about noise. And I actually, I think about that with robots as well. Sort of, it's really amazingly interesting to be in this robotics group, and coming from biology background, where, you know, their sort of first ideas are like, okay, what's the exact thing that's going to get us there? And so often with the ants, it seems to be like, let's not do an exact thing. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I don't have any other like really specific examples, other than I absolutely think that there's something interesting there. Yeah, cool thing to think about.
Thanks. So now it's Kaz. Sorry.
Thanks. Really cool talk. I really like the ant videos, are super sweet. I was wondering if you, and you kind of mentioned this, if you could give us more details on the model, the mechanistic model, because I'm a theory guy, so I'm interested in what makes the model mechanistic, and yeah, what if there's something we can learn about hysteresis or dynamical systems from this sort of modeling versus a kind of traditional, you know, kind of Diffie-Q approach. Well, we kind of get how these work and what the effects will be. How can the mechanism help us understand hysteresis maybe on a different level?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So let me start by giving you more information about the models. And I might forget the rest of the question by the time. I have a history of sort of forgetting half of questions, so feel free to please bug me again. But so yeah, so these there, I mean, even the accumulator model is really, really simple. So I'm actually not directly measuring ant traffic. I'm instead just in a particular time step, just there's a, you know, a certain number of events that happen in that time step, a certain number of joining and leaving events. And I know from the data with the levels of traffic that I typically experienced in the actual experiments, I sort of know what the distribution of joining and leaving events are. And so every time step in the simulations, I just drew, you know, said, okay, this time step, there's this many ants joining and this many ants leaving. And I don't allow there to be negative ants in the bridge. And so it's just sort of keeping track of that. And then the added complexity in the accumulator model is that they have that additional information of, you know, how far off are we from what in the experiments appears to be a pretty solid number of ants where there's the same number, the same probability of joining and leaving. So does that sort of answer, what other information about the model itself are you interested in knowing?
Cool, yeah.
So it's mechanistic only in the sense that that it's getting at sort of how are we like, so I guess there's sort of, I think of, the way I think of it is levels of like, and maybe my language isn't even as precise as it should be, but kind of there's, because the model isn't mechanistic in the sense of like, I don't know, you know, as I was describing, I don't know what proximate cues from the, it's not modeling that kind of information, and it's not modeling where the ants are in the bridge. And so that's actually, I think would be a really, that's a next step that I'm hoping we can, I can do in the next project with this is getting a much more careful accounting of sort of how they're physically what's happening within the bridge. But with the experiments that we have right now, it's really, really hard to see where the ants are and to model that kind of detail. Yeah, but I think with respect to the kind of what we can learn, you know, let me, instead of just like talking out of my head, remind me what it was you want to know about that.
Oh, you're totally on the right track. So yeah, thanks for the details of the model. So I guess if I'm understanding it correctly, I should think of kind of the number of ants kind of as a state variable, and we're kind of using the stochastic process to update it instead of kind of differential equation type thing.
Yes. I'm sorry. I did mean to say that this is, it's absolutely a stochastic model. Yeah.
And so like I usually deal with differential equations because I'm not smart enough to do stochastic things. And for me, it's like, okay, if I want to get histories from the system, I can put it in, you know? And so if we want to do it stochastically and we're using data, I guess I'm wondering, so what can someone like me learn from this approach? Like, what can we learn about dynamical systems by using this kind of more stochastic approach where does that make sense? Like you're manipulating the state variables stochastically.
I think that makes sense. I mean, so to some extent, you know, I made it a stochastic approach because, you know, actually this ties to Ari's question too. Ants are very stochastic and you know, the behavior is highly variable, and I didn't want to sort of lose that variation. And I think it's important, you know, in this case, actually, it was very important to see. So one of the main results that made me realize how much better the accumulator model was performing is the fact that the simulations of the later models performed so wildly variably. So, you know, the average behavior looked much more reasonable than, it still wasn't great, but it looked much more reasonable than the behaviors of any particular simulation. And so for this system, that I think was really important to see that, and to see where that accumulator model shines, I suppose. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
So next question is by Eli.
Hey, Ellen. Really nice talk and good to see you again.
You too.
I was curious about your bridge building project. You kind of alluded to this in your answer to Kaz's question, actually, but I was wondering if you noticed in your experiments that there were constraints on which individuals could leave the bridge, and if you think that might have something to do with or be involved somehow in the hysteresis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, so in some ways it kind of gets, that was sort of the idea behind making a delay. You know, with the simple modeling approach, as I said, first of all, yes, there are constraints in who can leave the bridge. And so, you know, I think actually, and we already know that from earlier work that the longer an ant has been in the bridge, the less likely they are to leave. And perhaps that's one possible explanation for that is also just like they might be more kind of thoroughly integrated, more central in the bridge. They might just actually be more constrained. You know, ants are seem to be anecdotally more likely to leave like from the bottom or from, you know, and actually this, I don't have enough rigorous data on this to really say it for certain, but I do have some data on, you know, are they joining and leading from the edges or the middle? And they're more likely, seem to be more likely to be doing that kind of from the middle rather than the edges. And the edges are like pretty important. They're really going to be stuck and stretched on the edges. So yes, I think that's important. For this project, we weren't able to sort of, rigorously look at that. But I think, so that's, we're like, okay, if an ant wants to leave but can't, maybe they're able to leave later. And we kind of looked at that with the delay. But really, I just think that I think they will only decide to leave, once they, or I suppose if they want to leave but can't, that like, does that matter? Not really, but because they're stuck. But I think that is important. And now if the ants are leaving but later because they might be constrained, that I think the delay model does kind of look at that and it was not sufficient, as we saw. So I think there's more to it than that. But yeah, I think it'd be really great to look at much more carefully at the dynamics of who is leaving, because I think that's likely to matter. I don't know if that really answers your question. It's a little hand wavy.
Yeah, it does. Great. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. Next question is Kano.
Hi, my video doesn't work, but a great talk, Doctor. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much. And the second study, so it's like a classic, detour task in animal psychology. I liked it. What about the collective learning aspect of that? Did you look at that? That, for instance, you kind of showed something like that in one graph, but what if that those ants in the same group face another trap on the way back?
Yeah,
Or
no, it's a really good question.
Or maybe that another possibility is that what if one of the member of the same group joins another group and they're facing the same problem or something? Did you ever try that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would love to look at learning in this behavior. I haven't looked at it. So I did this in the field. So these were with field colonies. Unfortunately, cooperative transport is extremely difficult to reproduce in the lab. Like in the lab, ants don't really seem to do it. And so that means keeping track of identity is hard, especially when these species have enormous colonies. With many thousands of ants. So I'm pretty confident that none of the ants are repeated just because the colonies are so enormous. So I think the idea was to sort of say, okay, this is the first time you're encountering this. And that's one. So we do expect, actually, because there's some possibility for the ants to use pheromone trails. I placed the obstacle only once they were about to hit it. So, these are sort of like new obstacles. If an obstacle was there for a long time and ants were coming and back foraging, you would expect them to avoid the obstacle without having to really interact with it much. I think it would be really interesting to be able to see whether a particular group hitting a series of obstacles might change their approach. Another thing that this doesn't answer your question, I don't think directly, but perhaps is related to it. So there's a third obstacle type that I gave them, which was actually truly a trap, so imagine that harder obstacle where I shut the door. So they were truly trapped in there. And I just wanted to see, would they give up? What do they do when there's no solution? And surprisingly, they basically did give up, like, right away. So their behavior, it did not look like they were navigating the harder obstacle and just kind of like eventually, just did that forever until they stopped. They very, very, very quickly were like, okay, we're giving up. And one possible explanation, very, very hypothetical, is that the other ants that are around these groups that are not connected to the thing that's being carried, so there's been some other work by Offer Feinerman's group that on this behavior that indicates that these other ants might play an important role. And we think from even much earlier work that they're called escort ants. They might be important. And when I trapped the ants, the escort ants, those other ants, you're not seeing them anymore. There's not like fresh new ants around. And so that isn't really about learning, but it is about, they're able to to distinguish pretty quickly between these two groups, and ants not directly connected could be important. So I guess I have a habit of like talking in other directions because I can't answer your real question, and I would love
very
to.
interesting.
But, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. And we have another question by Christophe.
Hello, thanks a lot for the talk. So I was wondering, in the trial and error difficult task, if there was also some evidence, or if you had the feeling that when they were going further away from the wall, if the dynamics of leaving and joining the piece of food was different. Or...
Oh yeah, great question. Yeah. So I looked at that pretty carefully. So I actually did. So, you know, because I was wondering, okay, I was wondering whether ants that kind of join might be providing new information. And I've just mentioned there's some other evidence from Ofer Feinemann's group in the same species that actually specifically does happen. But I wasn't finding that in this case. So what I looked for really carefully was in the kind of key decisions, the decisions that, meaning the times when they changed direction that allowed them to escape. I looked very, very carefully at what was happening in those moments. And there were some examples of times when ants just joined right before that change of direction that worked. And so I thought, oh, maybe that's an ant that knows where the door is. But actually, much more often, there was nobody joined, nobody left. I could see nothing I could see explained their change in direction. So that's why I think, yeah, I think these other ants that are around are sometimes very important, but I don't, yeah, there's actually less turnover within than I expected too. Just overall, there's not a whole lot of turnover. You know, ants do come and go, not as much as I initially expected. And it doesn't, there's, yeah, more, I can't remember, something like 60% or whatever. I just really couldn't tell anything in particular happening that would lead to that change of direction.
Chase.
Hi, wonderful talk. It was really wonderful to listen to. I'm wondering if you have experimented at all or thought about experimenting with some of these deep pose type programs in order to estimate force of each ant. It seems like, in answer to Eli's question and also this most recent question by Christophe, that you might be able to infer some estimate of both like how stretched out an ant is, or therefore like uncomfortable, or how much force they're exerting on the group in order to move them with some of these new tools.
That's a very interesting question. You know, I have not thought about using that kind of like using the pose of the ant to estimate that. Me, as well as other groups, actually. So Stephen Pratt's group in Arizona has done a lot of really cool work trying to directly measure the force that these ants are exerting in cooperative transport. And it's very hard. And I think, I mean, it's been a long time since I've talked to him about it, but I think I remember him saying like he doesn't feel like he's really nailed it down either. So yeah, it's really, really hard to get that kind of data. I hadn't thought about pose though, and so yeah, I should think about that more carefully. You know, I think, you know, would require a lot of assumptions, of course, but yeah, I would really love to be able to tell how much force in real time these ants are. And now I do think actually specifically with the crazy ants, the way that they carry these objects is they lift. So they don't necessarily, I think in real life, they don't like, the object doesn't necessarily clear the ground usually, although with the kind of simple small objects I was giving them, it very often did. So actually they're really just like lifting and walking. So you might only be able to, I would think that would make it harder to get force information from pose, but but there's certainly you could create circumstances where that you might be able to get so close. So that's interesting. Thanks. Yeah, it's a cool idea.
I think I speak for everybody if we thank Helen again so much for this wonderful talk and for being with us today. And thank you to all for joining us at this not too late hour, but unusual hour. So thanks a lot, and looking forward to seeing each other again in another seminar, and wishing you all a good rest of the day.
Yeah, thanks.
So
Not
much.
to interrupt, feel free to email me or reach out to me if you have questions later. And thank you so much.